Sometimes, if you're under surveillance, the people watching will leave a sign. They will scatter the papers on your desk, situate a half-drunk cup of tea, dresser drawers flung open. Sometimes, they want you to know about them. Once you spy a clump of blonde hair in the sink, everything is different for you. Grass will begin to grow where your brain once was, a smell of almonds. Did I see that car earlier? Right turn, right turn, right turn, work, grocery store, home, work, grocery store, home. Do not deviate from this pattern. Give them no reason to be suspicious. Bore them. Do not talk about illegally downloading MP3s. Do not talk about fudging on your taxes or smoking a joint. Avoid these activities altogether. And, if you can help it, do not own a cell phone. If you must, then vagueness is a virtue. You may even grow to like it, this feeling of perpetual company.
This is Brockport Writers Forum.
Good morning. We're very pleased to have with us today Derek Walcott.
Our guest today is John Barth.
Our guest today, Rita Dove.
Welcome Grace Paley to Brockport.
The writing of Isaac Bashevis Singer. The poetry of Robert Hayden.
Our very special guest today, Lucille Clifton.
Nadine Gordimer. The poetry of Anne Sexton. Today, the poetry of Seamus Heaney.
I wonder if you'd like to read a section from the novel.
Welcome to the television studio of SUNY Brockport. Deep within Edwards Hall, I'm Austin Bush, professor of early world literature in SUNY Brockport's English department and co-director of the Writers Forum. I'm joined by my colleague, Sharon Lubkman-Allen, a professor of comparative literature, also in Brockport's English department. And we're happy to welcome Sonya Bilocerkowycz to the Writers Forum today. Sonya has an MFA from Ohio State. Before that, she was a Fulbright Fellow in Belarus, and she worked in the Republic of Georgia as an educational recruiter. She also taught at Ukrainian National University in Lviv. Her essays have appeared in Guernica, Colorado Review, and the New York Review of Books, among other venues. And in 2022, she was named National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellow. Sonya is currently director of the Creative Writing Program at SUNY Geneseo, and her first book was On Our Way Home from the Revolution, Reflections on Ukraine from Ohio State University Press, their creative nonfiction imprint, Mad Creek Books. Hers is one of the most insightful voices in the U.S. writing and speaking about Ukraine today, especially after the start of the Russia-Ukrainian war, with Russia's occupation and annexation of Crimea in 2014 in the wake of the Maidan Revolution, in which Russia escalated by invading Ukraine early in 2022. So much of Sonya's writing, including and since On Our Way Home from the Revolution, addresses Ukraine's struggle for independence. So Sonya, your work, it certainly transcends the mode of discourse we know as political commentary. And when we invited you to the Writers Forum, well over a year now, at least I figured that kind of the current state of the war and the U.S.'s involvement in it would be in the background of our conversations, all right? But that we'd be leading with and really focus on your work as a writer and with your craft. We'll still do that, but it seems now that it's, really your thoughtful commentary that demands our initial attention. So our Writers Forum interviews go back to the 1960s, and they're meant to be accessed by scholars and readers in perpetuity. And so we rarely delve into issues of the day, but we make exceptions when the writers we visit happen to have written precisely about the issue of the day, right? And that rarely happens because we book these things in advance, right? We invited you over a year ago. But in any case, for the students and researchers of 2075 who are watching this, here's where we stand. The second Trump administration has recently begun. The U.S. had been supporting Ukraine throughout the war with material and intelligence. But on February 28th, the president of the U.S. Berated the Ukrainian President Zelensky in the Oval Office, and that was less than 2 weeks ago. And since then, the U.S. ceased military and intelligence aid to Ukraine. That was in advance of negotiations for a month-long ceasefire held in Saudi Arabia just this week. Today is March 12th, and that's still going on. Combined with other developments, it led some political observers to conclude that basically the U.S.'s policy would now be to work to advance Russian rather than Ukrainian interests in the conflict. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the only way to view the situation, and the ceasefire is still being brokered. We'll have to see what it looks like. But it's a view that some have coherently argued for. For instance, a distinguished military historian at the University of St. Andrews, Professor of Strategic Studies Phillips O'Brien, just one prominent scholar. And if it turns out to be right, it's a startling worldwide development, given the history of the U.S.'s involvement in Europe since the end of World War II, even if it's not entirely unpredictable given the current political climate here in the U.S. Now, there was a recent announcement after Ukraine agreed to the U.S. brokered ceasefire. Now, it's with Russia, that U.S. aid to Ukraine would resume. I don't know if that's been confirmed to have happened yet, but what it amounts to is that we're in the thick of it as we have this conversation with you, and we're going to have to see how everything plays out. So that's a much longer introduction than we ever do, but I think it was necessary given the state of affairs. And so here's my question on the basis of it, right? Your book is about a lot of stuff. It's about the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian war, right? It's about the war's historical backdrop in various European imperialisms. It's about the U.S.'s relationship to this conflict. And it's all filtered through your and your family's story as Ukrainian Americans with deep roots in the U.S. I mean, you're from South Dakota, of all places, right? But also with connections to Ukraine and this history of conflicts that have overtaken it throughout the 20th century. So I just want to start by just inviting you to give us your thoughts and feelings about where you see the Ukraine and the U.S. today from your personal perspective. And if you want to think about it, like, give us some notes for an essay that would be in the second edition of this book that came out a few years ago. Just want to give you a runway to talk to us about this, given where we are.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to comment too directly on the events that are like immediately unfolding this very week, but I will. Everything's changing so quickly, of course, but I will say that the current U.S. administration's shift in policy, which seems to be a shift in U.S. policy, both towards Ukraine and also towards Russia, I think should be viewed or can be viewed within like the larger ecosystem of policy changes that President Trump's regime is trying to implement. You know, for example, targeting and harassing immigrants, trans people, DEI, education and language in all of its different forms. All of these sort of moves towards authoritarianism, I think we can see his treatment of Ukraine, his interest in sort of humiliating the Ukrainian president and by extension the Ukrainian people as like within that larger ecosystem of sort of more authoritarian leaning impulses. I also guess maybe I would mention that while that should be viewed within sort of like that larger ecosystem, this is also not a divergence or a shift in terms of Trump's own personal approach to the issue of Ukraine or Russia. I believe the first time we have on record that Donald Trump mentioned his sort of admiration for Vladimir Putin was in 2007 on the Larry King Show. And even after Vladimir Putin's regime became sort of like more brazenly authoritarian and Putin's imperial ambitions became more clear and obvious in 2014, 2015, 2016, et cetera, Trump sort of continued to openly flatter and praise and express his admiration for Putin's leadership style. So while that feels like a shift in terms of general U.S. policy, towards Europe and towards Eastern Europe, this is not a shift in how, Trump himself has approached these partners, I guess you could say. So, yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
How about a follow-up to that? I'm just thinking, just to directly follow that up with that segment in the book when you're thinking about, one of the ironies in reading this text now is that segment of the book where you have a number of people referring to Putin as a thug, right? And I have sort of a dual question about that. One involves the irony that among those interlocutors or cited people in the text, you have people like Marco Rubio, right, and others. But another is that that becomes not just an opportunity for you to explore various perspectives on thuggery across the globe and in different cultural contexts, but also for thinking about language, right? And you think about language in various moments in the text. So one of the moments that I can think of is when you're thinking about your own personal experience. Again, sort of the personal history and personal familial relationship to Russia, and you make that move where you sort of begin to sort of think about it. Is this xenophobia? No. Is this bigotry? No. Is this, and you go through a whole series of terms. Another way in which you play with language is when you're thinking about collaboration, and you mentioned sort of, you look at sort of, again, in different moments in the text, a familial history of unanticipated collaboration, possibly not, with the Gestapo regime, and different ways in which that history's been written, rewritten. But then you also think about what it means to be a collaborator in art, right? And that's an entirely different thing. But then around this use of the term thug, in referring specifically, it's a moment in the text when you're talking about the first Trump administration, you're talking about views of Putin, you're also talking about other instances of the use of the word thug. But you think about the way in which language moves and in which our perspectives shift. So I guess I'm inviting you to talk about language and about shifting perspectives, and the way in which they work in this book, the way in which they work in terms of your perspective and the language surrounding the current events. So whichever way you want to take that conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for your close reading, and thank you for pulling all those different strands together. It's really exciting to hear your interpretation. I think so much about this project, although I didn't know this when I started writing it, but as I was writing it, I sort of discovered so much about this project was about inheritance. What do we inherit? And language and literal words are part of that, right? And so when my narrator in 2016 was seeing this politician come on the American scene who was not using the word thug to refer to Vladimir Putin, unlike all of his sort of Republican counterparts, it really got me thinking wait, is that even the right word? Why are we using that word? Also, that word has a lot of baggage and a whole other sort of context of meaning that's being cued by those politicians. So I found myself wondering what were we as a culture inheriting in terms of the quick usage of this word, or the sort of thoughtless usage of that word. And that kind of sent me on a voyage, right, as you indicated, where I asked, for example, the historian and Eastern European scholar Timothy Snyder, what did he think about this word thug? And his sort of, his answer to my question was I think it kind of flatters us, right? It's sort of an easy deflection from some of our own issues, which isn't to say, and Timothy Snyder has never made excuses, right, for Putin's actions or his regime, but that, again, to hear someone like Marco Rubio or, the governor of Ohio calling Vladimir Putin a thug, that it's sort of a bit of a diversion, maybe, in some ways. And I guess the other thing I'll say, too, is about language as part of our inheritance and the real close connection between language and myth making, right? And both of these sort of dual inheritances that my narrator really felt especially after being in Ukraine in 2013 and 14 and experiencing the Maidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity, firsthand, and watching as Russian troops occupied Crimea and started the war in the Donbass region. All this history was happening. And it got me thinking about like, wait, what language have I inherited from my family with regard to Russia? And by extension, what sort of mythology about us as Ukrainians or about them as Russians or about the sort of fraught relationship between the two of us, right? And I will say too, even since I've set these words in ink here, my feelings and my understanding has grown and evolved. It's a kind of impossible. This book came out in 2019, so 3 years before the full-scale invasion, and seeing kind of the way that Russian civilians, Russian soldiers, Russian officials, Russian state media have spoken about Ukrainians in the 3 years since the full-scale invasion began. That has also given me like a whole new set of sort of like data and information for thinking through the nuances of exactly what kind of relationship our groups of people have with each other, and by extension, like the language that we use to talk about those dynamics.
And it's interesting because you make a distinction, I think. I mean, for example, when you're talking about like the Russian voice, right? I mean, you make the distinction when you bring up Vanya, and his moving between all these different languages, and also, of course, he's a figure in the text who is a dissenting voice, who is displaced also by necessity, given the fact that he's dissenting, and so he's offering a Russian voice and yet a critical voice. You have other people in the text, like you quote Zhadan, and you note the way in which he originally wrote in Russian and was a primarily Russian speaker, but shifts to Ukrainian. So, I mean, there's even this question of languages as well as language, and this uniformity in terms of a cultural voice or a cultural imaginary, a commemorative voice that's sort of reductive, but then individual voices that are sort of dissenting in your story. I mean, so one of the interesting things is sort of sifting through language, but you're also sifting through things. You're, in commemorative things, busts, people, stories, like you said, like myths, and you're sifting through sites. You sort of remap these sites over and over again. You link sites, the kitchens, these 3 kitchens, but also by extension of those kitchens, you bring in a neighborhood, right, in Brooklyn that goes through these various waves of immigration. You bring in a valley that becomes a hill, that is a tomb, that is Babin Yar, that is a whole other sort of history of multiple victimizations. So can you tell us a little bit more about that sifting through language, sifting through the personal and the historical, sifting through different sites of memory?
Interesting, yeah. I mean, I guess maybe it's partially an obsession born of the diaspora experience, right? Which is that you are displaced by nature, right? Like there is a disconnect and a separation between you and the ancestral homeland or the indigenous homeland even. And it's interesting, right? One thing I wanted to explore in this book was the way that diaspora communities, Ukrainian diaspora communities in North America have kind of like reestablished their own corners or sites or neighborhoods or even buildings, right? To sort of like rebuild that kind of intergenerational sense of place and belonging and home. One of those being the Ukrainian village in New York City that you mentioned, also the Ukrainian village in Chicago, as well as our Ukrainian Scouting Organization's camp, which is a beautiful land in southern Wisconsin, sort of in the hills near Baraboo. And thinking about the ways that we've tried to sort of like recreate almost like a Carpathian sort of idyllic space there as a gathering place for all of the Ukrainians to come in the summer. So yeah, I guess growing up it was just like those sites were so important here in the States. Being able to go to a place where it was like, this is our collective community land. Like this is a place where we can fly the Ukrainian flag and it means something here. So perhaps that kind of sensibility is what maybe drives the narrator's obsession to also then, when she's in Ukraine, wanting to sort of like map certain parts of Kiev and understanding what kind of inheritances, what kind of generational cycles and traumas have occurred in those spaces as well.
To become very complicated inheritances that include a series of, I mean, like a series of, complexities, a series of complicities. And I mean, I think one of the interesting things you're bringing up, the fact that your book has this transcultural perspective. It's always in between, right? You know things from the inside, but you're also on the outside in each space, both here and there. And I mean, I think, so one of the questions is, and maybe this is a question that also applies to the current situation, but the question of responsibility and response, right? And always that response and responsibility having a different kind of consequence than the consequences felt by whomever is embedded just in one of those spaces, you know, who's there. I'm thinking of the moment, which is another intertextual moment from the passage that you read, where you were reading from your father's, you know, about your father's text, and you mentioned Bulgakov and his Master and Margarita, and you compare yourself to Anushka, right? And at the end, and you're sort of thinking about, you know, spilled oil, as simple as, you know, sort of being a minor figure, spilling oil, saying something, but how you can't clean the spill, and, you know, sort of Chernobyl, also a spill that can't be entirely cleaned up. But this way in which it is a spill that has implications or consequences. I mean, what do you see as the consequences, as the way in which the book is sort of trying to assume a kind of responsibility or engage with as a sort of response?
Yeah, I think I did not expect, for example, for this book to become one that needed to be so directly engaged with the Holocaust and the history of the Holocaust. I think, but once I dug into the 20th century Ukrainian history, it became clear that Ukraine's unfortunate fate of being right on the Eastern Front between the Nazi army and the Soviet army caused suffering for so many groups, you know, and namely and especially the Jewish people that lived on what is present-day Ukrainian territory. So as I sort of went back to dig, I recognized that this was a huge, this was going to be a huge development that I would have to engage with. And in order to engage with that ethically, I also realized it was going to require me to have really uncomfortable conversations about my own diaspora community, about the sort of whitewashing of particular Ukrainian figures who had been collaborators with the Nazi regime during the German occupation. It is an extremely ugly history. It is one born from a situation where Ukrainian people were stateless and therefore did not have a lot of good options. But that became, again, it became like part of the project of the book became me wanting to talk with my diaspora community and be like, you know, hey, we sort of have to maybe look at this differently. We maybe need to rethink how we mythologize and the language that we're using to talk about those moments in our history. Like, they are tragic, and also the suffering of other people does not have to negate the suffering that we experience too. There's this kind of like tension in some ways between, I think, these groups that have experienced so much, where it's like difficult to hold space, you know, for others, for the suffering of others. So it was really like messy, ugly, scary. Didn't want to have to write about any of that, but it became clear that that's where the book was going to go. And placing that then within the larger context of Russia's oppression of Ukrainian people, right? The Holodomor famine, as well as the current day sort of like Russian incursion. So yeah, trying to find room for all of that.
It's hard.
In terms of thinking about responsibility. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question about that. But before that, let's take a moment and listen to some informative announcements about life here at SUNY Brockport.
Looking to play baseball without it having been the center of your college attention? Well, I'm Joey Campbell, and I have a solution for you. The club baseball team of Brockport looks to compete in tournaments and games, all the while having great flexibility within student schedules. No curveballs. Don't strike out on this opportunity. Are you looking for more information? If so, slide over to our Instagram at Brockport Club Baseball and message us if you're interested in joining the team. See you on the diamond.
Are you a student or faculty member at SUNY Brockport and struggle with food insecurity? Prior to the pandemic, students took a survey and it was discovered that 45% of Brockport students could not afford food, leading them to being unable to focus on their studies. The pantry located in Daly Hall on campus offers various options from canned and frozen food to refrigerated items. The pantry works hard to prevent hunger across all individuals on campus. Stop by the pantry to grab your essentials to ensure that you are thriving here at SUNY Brockport. The pantry's got your back.
Are you interested in learning how to defend yourself or the ancient sport of mixed martial arts? Well, my name is Julia Shapansky and I'm a student here at SUNY Brockport and I have something for you. With practices every Tuesday and Thursday in Cooper Hall, the Brockport Taekwondo Club invites you to come out and train with us. We are currently in the top 10 college clubs associated with mixed martial arts. Our club aims for students to gain confidence, socialize with new people, and stay in great shape. For more information, please contact Black Belt Michael Jones.
A lot of people like to go to the cafe. But what is the real reason students go to the cafe? To get caffeinated. Come to the Rajmadan Cafe. We have everything to help you wake up and be motivated to complete those assignments. We have gourmet coffees and a varied tea selection. So no matter what you're looking for, we have you covered. Grab lunch or dessert to help you during your study session. Come visit us at Rajmadan Cafe in the Drake Memorial Library. I'm Harley Thomas and Amanda Wells produced this message. Please caffeinate responsibly.
We're back with Sonya Bilocerkowycz, author of On Our Way Home from the Revolution, Reflections on Ukraine. Sonya, I'm interested in how different levels of your work sort of interact with one another. So on one level, it's kind of like a memoir, and I appreciate you referring to the I in it as your narrator, right? Not strictly as yourself. But as a memoir, it's also in some ways a cipher, or maybe even a sort of metaphor for Ukraine itself, or certain elements are. And then it's also the process of personal memory, which is also the process of national memory, as we were talking about with reference to the Holocaust, for instance. That's sort of reflected in the book itself by, for instance, these two chapters that have the same title. Right, Village, and then a later one with Village, I think a different parenthetical clarification, which is like a textual memory of the earlier chapter, a demythologization of it, a revision of it. And it just seems like there's a sort of almost aggressively inquisitive nature in all of this. Like, let's just figure out what really happened, what actually lies at the heart of this, whether or not it's flattering and just sort of deal with it. And I'm just wondering, like, what's the connection between that in terms of writing, that process in terms of writing, and then that process in terms of politics and in terms of just living one's life, because they seem to be really closely related in your book.
Yeah, so when I started writing this book, the title essay, On Our Way Home from the Revolution, I wrote in 2014. So that was over a decade ago now. And I wrote it as a standalone essay. I had just gotten home from Ukraine. I had witnessed, like, as one of my students there said, something like 400 years of history happening in 3 months. Like, time felt like it was on fast forward. And I came back to graduate school and I was in an MFA program. And of course, all I could think about was what I had just seen a few months prior. So I began with the title essay, and it was just an essay to figure out, what did it mean for me as an American to be there in the middle of the revolution in the center of Kiev as Ukrainian people were protesting against the Yanukovych regime, who was a pro-Russian Ukrainian president at the time, protesting against sort of like his regime of corruption and violence, really state violence. So I sat down with limited parameters, which was to write an essay, and that essay then became like another essay, and then I wrote another essay. And again, I was thinking about all of these as sort of like discrete explorations. I was really lucky to have wonderful mentors in grad school, including Lena Ferreira, who got me thinking about the essay, you know, returning to the sort of Montaignian roots of the term essayer, meaning to try or to attempt. And so I got had a lot of encouragement to think of the essay as an attempt to communicate something, as an attempt to answer something, with the emphasis there being on the process, the attempt, not necessarily you will succeed, that you have succeeded in finding the answer to what it means, right? But that by essaying as a verb, you are en route. It's all about the process. So again, I was writing these sort of discrete essays that were revolving around these questions about identity and Ukrainian history and my family's history and connection to those. And it wasn't until about 2 years of kind of compiling these that I, looked at them all and realized, oh, these are all connected. This is potentially, there's an arc here that I could build in terms of a manuscript project. In order to kind of realize it as an arc, I had to think specifically about the village. And those essays, which are a bit shorter and are kind of this sort of recurring title, as you said, is meant to serve as this kind of connective tissue that also challenges itself every time it comes back, as you so appropriately pointed out. But so those were really written as towards the later end of the process, as I was starting to recognize that, okay, I had these larger sort of pieces, but I need more of a through line that kind of is doing the work of braiding the research, my personal experience, and the family sort of experience. So that was kind of how I came to, I guess, that structure, and how the idea of the essay as a form was really my entry point into this book. There was one point when I was basically done with the manuscript that I was sort of shopping it around to publishers, or to agents rather. And one agent had told me yeah, it's really great, but make it a memoir. Just use regular chapters. Don't do essays. And I thought about trying to do that, and it was very daunting. And I realized that this, at least in its current form, this is what this was going to live as, no matter what. It was these different essays where I was revolving, spinning my wheels on these questions, each of them an attempt, maybe with success, right? Who knows? But
yeah, I think one of the most interesting aspects of the book, for me, formally speaking, is the way in which you interpolate different kinds of discourses. At times you even have an image in the text. But I think of other writers who do that, right? Who are, Alexander Hyman being one of them, but others who are also doing that kind of work. Bielorusits in the Ukrainian context, right? So I'm actually wondering about that because, first of all, one thing I'll observe is that there are a number of other resonances. So in the passage with which you opened, you notice the smell of almonds, right? And of course I think that first comes up when you're talking about, you're sort of thinking that there is no intergenerational trauma or reckoning with intergenerational memory and epigenetics. And then, but the almonds come up and the smell of almonds multiple times as you sort of, across those essays, as you are sort of reckoning with the traces of memory and so forth. But what I want to ask about is the way in which you interpolate different kinds of discourse. There's sort of the essay that is kind of a guide to a space. There is the essays in which you're playing with language. The encyclopedia. There are the interpolations of documents. Sort of rewritten, right? But Article 54. And the document from the camp that you went to as a child, and and also in the samizdat you have those little gray sort of bits of text that are excerpted. Of course, you have the moments of quotes, these sorts of things. But you have all these different discourses at play, and the novel is, or I guess this is not a novel. So, but anyway, but prose lends itself to that kind of play, and but how intentional was that? What were you hoping to do with that interpolation of different kinds of discourse in the text?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure how intentional it was really up front, but I think it was sort of this instinct that developed out of recognizing that I did like literal archival work, and then also this kind of like more amateur archival work of like collecting, right, fragments and texts. And I mean, something really interesting happened when I did receive the archive documents related to the criminal file of my great-grandfather. I realized that like, oh wow, here I have this official document with a stamp and a date and his full name and the village he was born in, and my grandmother's name was on it. And yet having that document suddenly opened up like this chasm of new questions. Like it was actually, it told one story, but it was not actually possible to understand how true that story was or to whom that story was true, right? There was like, suddenly I was like almost more confused than before I had gotten this information. And so I think wrestling with the archives, like I'm using that term kind of broadly, wrestling with archives in general was something that just became kind of like a mode of the book. And so the fragmentation and the like inclusion of these different like forms of text, I think are sort of a reflection of that. It's in particular the Samizdat essay where I have those sort of like pull quotes from the books I'm talking about. I was hoping they would kind of function as a sort of like subtext, right? The idea of Samizdat being that this is self-published material for folks who are living under oppressive regimes. They cannot like publish these ideas or thoughts openly, and so they self-publish and circulate those texts underground, right? That's the term that gets used. So my hope was that by sort of like pulling these quotes, they could serve as almost like a second underground kind of text for the essay, to kind of like emphasize and highlight those two different layers, and also to emphasize the idea, kind of going back to your original question about like language, right? The idea that once you set something into language, it calcifies in a weird way, or like it has the potential, I guess, to calcify. Sometimes it moves and flits and changes across context, but you're also, there's like a gesture of like permanency that happens when you set anything into language. So yeah, I guess it's just like kind of like coping with, playing with the tensions between all like the fragmentation of archival work and also the desire to make something, to like record something and document it and have a kind of permanency. So all of that is like happening at the same time, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, with the language, I mean, one thing I recall, there's a passage, I've written it down here somewhere and have a page number, but in any case where you do talk about language moving and shifting across continents, across centuries, across, you know, this sort of space. But it's interesting that you use the term, on the one hand, calcification, on the other hand, you've got this image of sort of spills, right, which suggests a sort of leaching into the ground, leaching into the body, leaching into the mind, and has a sort of a more organic, I mean, it's both calcifying and doing that sort of work. But it strikes me that the work also works as a kind of salvage, right? I mean, like archival work, but salvage and salvaging things. And you offer, I'm thinking again of the camp that you were just talking about again, and you're talking about those four statues, those four figures that you're trying to sort of rethink the histories of and the way in which these figures are perceived from different perspectives. But then you suggest, okay, well, there's also this art as an alternative and these artists, and why do we not have these artists as sort of the figures in which around which we sort of calcify or build or mythologize cultural memory? And you suggest that art and, you know, this as a literary text would function that way, might work as something more I don't know, more constructive.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the work that you're doing is deconstructive, and it also seems, though, that you're sort of constructing an alternative vision that is more inclusive and inclusive of sort of the scarred body and the, you know, as well as the, you know, but that's surviving. I mean, that's another thing you point out. Interestingly, in the text, at some point you say, well, the one thing I know is that I'm alive. Right, that I'm here, that we survived. And that's an interesting sort of through line in the text, this knowing that I'm alive, knowing that I'm here. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, yeah, it's like right after sifting through all of those fragments, all of the archives, everything, you're like all that history, right? And you end up at a place where you're kind of like you have more information, but you're also more confused about how to find meaning in it. I guess, yeah, my narrator was sort of like, well, the one thing I know for certain is that I am here as a result of these various things that had happened, and that counts for something. And I wanted to mention too about your note about the artists. That sort of ends up becoming like a kind of accidental thesis statement that I had stumbled upon as I was writing. This idea that like maybe we can make a more benign and more inclusive Ukrainian mythology when the artists are at the center. And I should say that criticism or that critique is sort of like very particularly directed at my third wave diaspora community, and that I would say in Ukraine today, especially following the full-scale invasion or in light of the full-scale invasion, artists are absolutely revered and artists are on the front lines. Artists have put their craft aside to protect their homeland, understanding that under Russian occupation, they will not be able to make art, and therefore it is worth it to them to put their instruments down, to stop working on the novel they were working on, and to enlist, basically. So yeah, artists as maybe perhaps a more benign figure, but certainly not as a figure that isn't also militarized or that doesn't also engage in direct resistance. Yeah, that's like a more recent development, I guess I could say, or at least in my understanding of our culture.
Well, even writing seems to function sometimes as an act of, I mean, there are a lot of Ukrainian writers still writing, and that also as an act of defiance or something. But even your writing sometimes you sort of interrogate it as, is this a betrayal? Is this, is there violence inherent in what I'm saying? What's in the silences and the things that are said? I mean, so that writing itself has a kind of,
yeah,
I don't know, activism.
Well, yeah, maybe to ask a question, a related question. Your art is writing, and maybe storytelling is part of it, or maybe even the central part of it. And even as you just articulated that answer to Sharon's question, there was this sense of sort of the ethical responsibility that one has as an artist and that one has as a storyteller. Yet at the same time, so you have that like firm, really well articulated, almost passion, right? That this is something that we need to be able to do. It's part of telling the truth. Yet, in your work, really, it's exemplary. I mean, it's one of the wonderful things about this book that I found, that your understanding of the situation you're in, or of the history you're telling, or the story you're telling, it's constantly changing, right? It's like there's this impulse that you need to do the right thing in what you say, but also this understanding that it's really difficult to know exactly what that is, because everything, how do you balance those two things? Your book seems to be trying to do that, and maybe even about that, but I'm just curious, how would you articulate that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I would say inelegantly is mostly how I do. Yeah, I don't know. I guess, again, we're kind of having this conversation at a really particular moment where over the last 3 years, I have seen my role as a diasporic writer in particular shift a bit to, I think about the ways that my art can help me to raise funds that I can send to people on the front line. It's not... It's very material and very straightforward, right? I have friends who were artists in Ukraine, who worked in video production, editing, and are now learning how to fly drones, and they need support, So thinking about, for my speaker honorariums, for things I get published, literally taking funds and redirecting it to folks on the ground. That is sort of how I personally have like decided to answer to this moment where I get to keep making art and keep, you know, being able to use like the little bit of a platform that I sort of have. And I'm, you know, so grateful for opportunities like this where folks want to engage with Ukraine and Ukrainian history. But for me to just simply write in this moment is like not enough. Like I have decided that for now it is not enough. Like it has to, for me at least, and everyone has to negotiate that differently, but for me it's like it has to be writing plus material aid, basically.
That's really interesting, because another way to answer that question, and the way some people would answer that question, would be by, well, they might not articulate it this way, but writing becomes propaganda, right? That's another way.
That's a great point.
And what I found interesting, and my students observe this as well, is that like how intensely this book, even though it has a particular political point of view, obviously sort of resists that. Like one of the most powerful things about the final iteration of The Village is you come across a truth in your personal family that aligns on some level with the Russian propaganda, you know, opposed to Ukraine. And you recognize that, right? And and to some extent, because of the historical contingencies, you even have some suspicion about the verity of the archive that you found. But nonetheless, you're like, this seems plausible. I have a responsibility as a writer to sort of engage with it, and you do. And that to me, that just was sort of, it's interesting that even when you did articulate your passion, it wasn't a passion that influenced so much what you wrote or what you chose not to say, but how you chose to contextualize your writing in your in sort of your broader life. Is that a fair way of like?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point, and I really appreciate the note that this doesn't feel like propaganda, because my narrator is so like allergic to it, right?
Right.
And it is this constant revision of like, oh, I used to think that, but now I'm questioning it, or right, like. And again, I feel like I kind of want to go back to like the essay as kind of like this capacious space where you're sort of like really allowed to ask that question, and that can be on the page, and it doesn't have to be like separate from the work that's happening within the essay. And I guess that's one hope for my body of work in general, that in every piece there is a kind of like reckoning or re-looking at something, or revision of an idea and an approach, and that hopefully again that can be an ethic that one could trace across different things, you know, whether I'm writing it now or in 2019 and before.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Sonya, for joining us here at Brockport today. And I'd like to thank our crew. Director Harley Thomas, Technical Director Rachel Ekstrom. On audio is Daniel Bradley, Kyron Robert Calhoun, and our camera people are Julia Suspansky, Sam Robinson, Joey Campbell, Dominic Muzak was floor manager, and as always, Michael Smith served as lead engineer, and Professor Carvin Eisen has managed this production. So thank you, and we'll see you again.